Thank you so much, Mrs. Wilson, for the introduction and for the invite. Thank you so much, everyone who is attending, both in person and on Zoom and calling in. It's a very great privilege and a great honor to be here. So it's actually quite interesting. Again, everything Hashem orchestrates. When the topic was first brought up, I was going to give over a certain approach that I learned and I really appreciated many years ago, about 15 years ago, a certain approach that I really appreciated. And then last week, I was actually at a conference of rabbis and rebbitzins and machamchim in London, and they had a guest speaker, Rabbi Moshe Weinberger from New York, and he shared something very fascinating about Yaakov and Esau in a totally different type of, really a totally different type of way and a totally different type of lesson that came out of it. And I just thought, I heard this last week, and I got some of the sources here with me, and I just thought it'd be something really, I think, something quite different, as a very different approach to perhaps what you've heard in the past. And I've already shared this with some other groups this week. And as Hashem, with Hashem's help, this will be something which will really get us thinking, really get us thinking. Which I think is really the aim, not just to learn, but to get us to think as well. Okay, so and again, I don't know how interactive this share is or isn't. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and it's totally fine. I'm happy to talk to myself as well and to answer the questions. You're welcome to give some suggestions. It's very open, and however you would like it. So if I had to ask like this, what's necessary, what's needed in order to be happy?
Peace of mind.
Okay, so, and again, I'm sure there's no right or wrong answer to this. So peace of mind, perhaps. Okay, nice. Positivity, yeah, peace of mind, positivity. Gratitude. Content with one's lot, right? Like Perkiyavos and other places. So some really beautiful ideas. Anything else? What does one need in order to be happy? Bitachon is a big one, to have the right amount of faith. Not always so easy, but yeah, absolutely. If one can get to that sort of level, absolutely, to get to the level of bitachon, it's gonna make it much easier. I can see I'm not in the middle of the screen here. I think the camera's on the side a little bit. Is that right? I'm sensing I'm either going to be good for Zoom, good for the room, perhaps good for neither. My face is quite round in this one as well. Okay, we're okay. Okay, so we're discussing right now perhaps what is needed, the qualities needed to be happy. We've had some really nice suggestions around the room. Now let me share with you again the way that Ramesh Weinberger put it. He put it over sort of as a bit of a fact. But since then, I actually had a very fascinating conversation with someone, and perhaps we'll see by the time we're done. Perhaps the answer or an answer, an approach, will be based on the approach that we're going to see. So I had a very fascinating conversation with somebody earlier on in this week, and again, it doesn't really matter at what stage of life it is, and this could happen really in any relationship. It happens to be, in their case, it was in a relationship of marriage, but I think this could very much be in any relationship at all. And they were discussing that in their particular relationship with whoever they were dealing with. And again, I'm going to change some of the details. And again, it doesn't matter. It was a marriage. It was a this. It was a that. Is not important, but because I think it's the same concept. That they are in a very stressful situation because the other person in that particular relationship, they sort of feel is perhaps looking for something different to what they can offer. Right? They feel that they are able to offer X, and they feel that the other person in the relationship, I said, it doesn't make a difference whether it's a marriage or whether it's a business or whether it's friendship. I don't think it makes any difference in terms of what the relationship was, but they feel that the other person is not, it's basically, it's not going very well, or there's some serious friction because the other person really wants something very different. Again, we could come up with the classical stereotypical jokes between males and females in terms of listening and in terms of whatever it is, but I don't think it makes a difference what the relationship is. Whatever the relationship is between two people, and there's a level of, this person's giving me a level of frustration, real level of frustration that is coming to me sort of for a solution, or perhaps maybe an ear or a solution or perhaps an ongoing, some sort of help to sort of reprogram their minds. But as to what was going on and what they could sort of go from there, because when one person feels that they've got to give something and the other person clearly is not responding to that, isn't interested in what they want to give and wants something totally different, then there's obviously something there that is very there's something that is missing. There's an issue there, and I was really thinking about it. But again, without going to the details of it, again, it could be in any relationship at all. But how should we possibly lessen stress in such a situation? How could stress get lessened? How could we make the situation better when you've got two people where one person keeps feeling they've got to give A to the other person, and the other person is not interested in A, keeps throwing it back and wants B, and the stress is immense. What could possibly help with that dynamic? How could we lessen the stress? Please, I think someone on Zoom wants to say something.
Try giving B.
By giving B, and I think that's great. The challenge that you often have is that if the first person is so wired that they've got to give A, it's like it's again, there's obviously there's intellect and there's emotion, but when the person is so wired, at least emotionally, that they've got to give A no matter what, it's very, very hard to all of a sudden to start giving B. There needs to be like some sort of rationale or maybe emotional rationale even behind what's going on in order that the person could switch, because they probably deep down, actually, I'm not even sure if deep down they realize that they're giving the wrong thing until I brought it to their attention. They just kept thinking, this is what I need to give. And it's very, very stressful because the other person just doesn't, it's just not responding to it. And it would keep saying, that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for something totally, totally different. Yes.
Why would A want to continue? I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
Somebody keeps giving flowers to somebody who gets thrown cake and doesn't really want. But somehow they're kind of like, oh, we must give flowers. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the other person wants to go for long walks all the time. But the person who doesn't want to go for long walks, they want to sit up.
Yeah. Sure.
So that's a bit of thinking that I'll find somebody else. So I'll find somebody else to go for walks. And
right.
A little bit of thinking, listening to the person, oh gosh, I didn't know you had to overhead either. Negotiation.
So that could be a possible solution. I think it's listening. I think it's one of negotiation. That doesn't even, but here it's very interesting because it's not that you need a negotiation because the person is saying, I don't want to, I want something back in return. They're just giving the wrong thing. And they don't seem able to emotionally or intellectually understand that they're giving the wrong thing. They just don't seem able to appreciate it. For some reason, they just feel they've got to keep giving this thing and just keep going with it. It's not like a negotiation is where, person A wants something and person B wants something and you sort of have to negotiate in the middle. Okay, that can happen any relationship, period, anywhere.
If you feel something is important in a relationship,
yeah.
From your point of view,
yeah.
It must be very hard.
Right, it's like when you give someone a gift and they don't want it, the different love languages and and so on. Maybe it's 100%. Again, I think we're going to sort of link this all back in together, and maybe we'll come up with maybe a bit of a different approach as well, based on something that I've learned in the last week. Very, very interesting principle. Because again, normally I think the understanding and negotiation, all of these things and compromise could help. Here it's a very different situation because the other person isn't even asking. Is like they're just like sort of giving the wrong thing. Okay, good. But again, so what we've looked at so far is what does one need to be happy, how to lessen stress in a relationship where someone keeps thinking that they've got to give the wrong thing, and not even necessarily realizing and not even understanding that it's the wrong thing. How to on a mindset level approach that and get rid of the stress. And the third thing we're going to look at, of course, which is why we're here this evening is. Although I'm going to ask this in a certain type of way, because now we're going to get into the topic of Yaakov and Esau, the eternal struggle, or whatever it was called, it's beautifully named. But I'm going to ask you the following question, and there's so many answers. Why did Esau become so evil?
Jealousy.
Okay, possibly jealousy. Again, there's many classical answers to this. So possibly jealousy. What else?
Didn't have good wives, did they?
Didn't have.
Good wives.
Okay, so perhaps the spouse could pull him away from where he should be, or perhaps friends or bad influences or whatever. Yeah, please. Anyone else? Perhaps there was a self-esteem issue. Perhaps. Then the commentators go to town at this, right? As to what. Right, which gets into right. Oh, really? So I was actually thinking originally. I've got a whole approach. Israel Tabor's got a fascinating approach. I'm not going that way tonight. It's a very fascinating approach to where free will actually was. Okay, so yeah, it's a very, very, very fascinating. Very fascinating thought in terms of, was it even before birth? How could that be? Okay, and how it sort of all comes together. Okay, good. So that's what we're looking at. Why you need what you need to be happy. How to lessen stress in a relationship where you keep giving the different to what the other person feels that they need. For some reason, we keep, and I think we all do. We keep giving things that they're not looking for. Again, I think all of us could relate to that. It doesn't matter what stage of life. It doesn't matter whether it's with younger generations. We keep giving the wrong thing. Whether it's with the same generation, whether it's with friends, it doesn't really matter. I think we can all relate to that. And we're going to look at tonight, why did Esau become so evil? And again, I think we know some of the classical answers. Some of them we've already, brought up or discussed tonight. So others we've heard in the past. Okay, so I've got in front of me 3 sources, and I'll go as far as I feel that it seems to make sense. Again, I could really go through it word by word for some of the sources. I got some handouts, and I didn't appreciate it being on Zoom. Maybe I'll share the screen. But again, I don't think the timing is so important. I think that to come out with a new concept and how to apply it, I think is more important than it's a few minutes shorter, a few minutes longer. But don't get scared. I'm not suggesting going over the time. I may just actually paraphrase some of this. Maybe it'll be a little bit perhaps a little bit shorter. But I want because I've got a long handout here. But the point is just to make sure that we've got clarity in a new approach, which I think is very, very fascinating. I think whatever stage of life we're at, I think really could relate to many of our relationships. Okay, so I've got 3 sources. The first source, I don't want to dwell on too long. It's a very difficult, complex source. And I just want to share a few words for it, which really then lead us into source 2. And I think at that point already, we're going to answer question 1 and question 2. Okay, so source 1 is dealing with the sin. It goes back all the way back to the sin, Chet Adam Arishon, the sin of Adam, the sin of Adam, right? Okay, so of course, he does what he does, and with the whole story with the snake and the tree. So this is an expression actually that Rav Kook uses, and he says, "V'aved es atzmai." He lost his atzmai, his etzem, his self. He lost his self with what he did. We'll explain exactly what that means in a few minutes. But he says he sort of lost the clarity and who he himself was. He lost that clarity of who he was, to the extent that what question is Adam asked by Hashem? Ayaka, right? Which means, how do we normally translate Ayaka? Okay, so again, Ayako, right? Let's say it's where are you? So of course, it's a very difficult question to understand because obviously Hashem knows where he is, etc., etc. And all the different answers are given in terms of what exactly it means. So Rav Kook is going to suggest that with a slight, I think a different approach. But what he's going to suggest is that he wasn't necessarily asking the where, but he was asking the who. Because again, his concept is because when you sin and when your level drops, and there's something, there's something going on, there's a barrier there, then you lose yourself. So Shem is now asking Ayeko, like, who are you? Like, what's going on over here? Like, do you not understand who you are? Like, what your purpose is, what I've put you here for, what you're supposed to be doing? Like, what's going on? What's going on? What's happening? Ayeko, like, who are you? What are you? Like, what's going on over here? So he says the result of that sin was, he says, Shelo yada nafsho, he did not know his nefesh, he didn't know his soul anymore, he didn't know who he was. Like there was something missing, there was something that was lost. And he says when Bnei Yisrael, when we sin, then there is on some level there's a sense of us losing and not knowing who we are anymore. Okay, so that's I don't again. It's a very, very hard source, and he speaks it out. I don't want to go further with this source, but the concept we're going to borrow into source 2, which is actually also from Rav Kook. again, the source really is the concept of, again, we sin or whatever it is, and sometimes we don't know who we are. And we sort of forget who we are. Maybe we don't know who we are. Maybe it's a punishment. Or the reality is sometimes we sort of don't know or forget what our tachlis, our purpose is, or what our neshama really is going towards. So the second piece is a very fascinating piece. Now he's probably speaking more to the male side, and maybe even more of a young guy who's learning. But I think that the concept can get applied to every single person. So he's speaking about somebody. He's speaking about in the realm of ruchnius, of learning Torah. Okay, so we're not speaking about physicality or whatever. We're speaking about ruchnius, spirituality. So I'm going to assume he doesn't speak this out, but I'm going to assume that he's speaking about a guy who, we're not talking about somebody who became religious yesterday or going through the process, and doesn't really know where he is and doesn't really know what to learn and how to learn. I'm going to assume for our purposes that we're talking about somebody who has been brought up in a yeshiva environment and has already been learning and has already got a big handle in terms of the Torah world. So he says the following. He says, let's say a guy, he said the way that Hashem made him is that his brain really connects and functions well in the realm of Agada. Now, you're familiar with what Agada is? So when you look at the Gemara, you have got like the two sides. You've got more of the halacha, what the law that comes out, and then you've got like the story part of it, which has the many commentators. There's the Maharal and the Mashar, and many others who give tremendous lessons based on it. And many of the great rabbis, they expound, and they'll give you divrei Torah and shiurim and so on and so forth based on the agadic part of Torah. It's a significant major part of Torah. It's not just some random stories that are thrown in here and there. It's a major part of Torah. So the example he gives is, let's say a guy, the way that his brain works, he doesn't have, I guess, what we would call the stereotypical type of yeshiva brain, the Gemara brain, the Gemara copy, he's sitting in yeshiva, and he can focus at 10, 8, 12 hours a day on Gemara. And I'm going to assume for our purposes that the guy tried for years, and he did the best that he could. Let's just say. And now he's got to a certain point where he says that all his friends are learning halacha. They're learning, maybe they're in a kollel somewhere that's learning halacha, Jewish law, in depth. And this guy is really struggling because they're getting total clarity in it and they're thriving in it, and he's barely getting it. It doesn't mean that this is a guy, we're not discussing that does this guy need to know how to keep Shabbos, how to make brachos. We're going to assume that he's got all of that. But in terms of what he should be at that point, now that he's discovered himself and he's worked out who he is and what he's not, and there's a certain level of maturity that gets to a point you've sort of got to specialize in terms of the koichos, the unique talents and potential that Hashem has given you. And for this guy, where all of his friends, their brain, he's sitting in some kollel somewhere and they're all learning their halacha, and he can't deal with it because he's got to a point where he realizes his brain functions much better in the realm of, let's say, Agada, of the teachings and the mussar that comes out of it, and the hashkafa and all these different things that come out of it, and he's sort of being thrown into it because he feels he has to, together with these friends of his who are learning halacha. He doesn't really accomplish it. He doesn't really pick up what's going on. He's behind. He doesn't really get it, and he knows what he needs to know in order to learn. But he's got a limited amount of time, and what should he do? So he says, again, the way that he says it, again, he's learning halacha because that's what people do. You go into kollalim or that world, and that's what they are learning. Okay, he says, but the problem is, again, I'm translating from the Hebrew over here. He says the challenge is that wasn't the teva, that wasn't like the nature of how Hashem made him. Yes, he has to learn halacha. Yes, he has to do the best he has, to be able to have, to know how to live as a Jew. And if he's a boy, to have tried to learn Gemara, literally given it his all. But now he's at a point, again, let's say he's a guy who's 23 years old, now has to, work out what he's going to do in life. And you're going to carry on throwing him into, to learn something that his brain just can't connect with day after day. He says the problem is going to be, he actually goes very far over here, and he says the problem is going to be what happens when somebody is forced into to do something that they can't do and everybody else is excelling at it? Well, if it's literally the brain doesn't work that way, and again, we're not talking about necessarily a young kid, it could be a problem with a young kid as well, it could be even a bigger problem, but you could end up despising what you have, maybe end up being a little bit negative towards perhaps even Yiddishkeit, who knows? Because at the end of the day, the guy, Hashem gave him certain talents, and he's trying to be someone else. He's trying to be someone else. And he just can't do it. It's too difficult, and he's never going to be able to do it. We're not talking about a guy who, is a little bit behind. If he works hard, we're talking about a guy who's in his 20s, who's, again, I don't know what the equivalent would be, but again, if you've got, people are intellectual, some people are more academic. Everyone's got to know, who they are and what they are. But you've got the guy here, and he's just he's never gonna accomplish this. This is not who he is, and and he's incredibly intelligent in other areas. Right? Incredibly intelligent. When it comes to the agodic teachings, this guy is the genius. This guy is the guy in the next generation who could give over the shiurim in this area. The challenge is that he's not really being allowed to develop himself there, because perhaps all his friends are going in a certain way. Again, I think we can all relate to this on so many different levels. Whether it's how we relate. It doesn't matter whether it's with our children, grandchildren. It doesn't matter. It's like, again, the stereotypical jokes. You've got to become the doctor. You've got to become this, or you're not satisfied unless you're getting a certain grade. But perhaps the child or the grandchild or whoever it is, perhaps Hashem gave them a different talent. If they've done the best that they can, and they're actually going and they're doing everything they can, perhaps they're made more creative. Perhaps they're going to be the creative person, or perhaps they're going to be the musical person, or whatever it is. And we're not talking about someone who's shirking responsibilities. Again, the school system is its own challenge because it's made for a particular type. Okay, we're not getting into. I'm not here to blast the school system, but the point is that it is a significant challenge. And he speaks about how if you don't know who you are, then it's very, very challenging. Because you could end up trying to be someone else and trying to connect with a whole group of other people. You could end up resenting what you're doing, and perhaps even resenting Yiddishkeit. Again, I think many of us unfortunately can nod and can relate to this, because it doesn't matter whether it's a more of a mundane world where we're sort of telling our children, grandchildren, and getting frustrated, disappointed unless they are doing what we want, what we did, or why can't you be like your sibling? Or whatever it is. But the reality is Hashem made people with different kishronos and different talents and in a different way. And you have to do the best that you can. But in the end, you want to set them for a life where they're actually going to be successful with who they are and what they are. Okay. So before we go into the Yaakov and Esau part, in terms of the first two things that we asked, again, we will re-wrap this up towards the end. We asked, the very first thing was, what ingredients are needed to be happy? All the answers that we brought, I think, are very beautiful and incredibly important. Hasameach b'chelkai, and all these different mindset things, they're incredibly important. But I'm giving you another one here based on the two sources that we've learned. If you know who you are, you've got a chance. If you keep thinking as someone else and you keep trying to be someone else, and you go through your life like that, maybe because you're being told you're someone else, maybe because emotionally you feel you should be someone else, you've got a real challenge. I've got someone that I'm working with right now professionally, who is struggling in all different types of regards. Again, you never in a million years work out. I'm talking about someone in this country struggling in so many regards, a very mature, successful adult, because they keep thinking. They recently wrote me up a mission statement, and I took one look at it. I said, why do you send me your brothers? There's a struggle with accepting who they are. Maybe it's because it's coming from a place, I don't know where it's coming from. Maybe it's coming from a place of negativity. Maybe it's coming from a place of guilt. Maybe it's coming from a place, I don't know, perhaps the parent drummed it in that you should be X, and that's not how they're wired. And the reality is they're a very successful adult, but there's a struggle. There's a real struggle going on because they keep trying to be someone else. Everything that they're doing in their personal, professional life, they're trying to be someone else, and it keeps pulling them down. It's a tremendous, tremendous problem. Until they're able to get past that, I don't understand how it's possible to be happy. They'll keep patching it over with, this plaster and that plaster, and I'll be happy temporarily, but they're going to keep getting knocked down because they keep trying to be someone else. A huge ingredient, what we've learned this evening already, is you've got to know who you are. And again, it's not just who you are, it's people that we are dealing with. Doesn't matter whether, again, people of our generation, whether it's children, grandchildren, doesn't matter. If we try and develop people to be someone that they're not, and get frustrated when they're not going to be able to thrive and be happy. And it's a big challenge. Again, I've also got kids. I've also got a family, and it's it's a struggle. I'm sure sometimes my own kids would say, "Wow, you would want me to be like my sibling," and it's not. I like to honestly say it's not true, but the reality is it's a struggle for every parent to also accept. Hashem made you in a certain way, and you're academic, and perhaps you're not, or whatever it is. But to encourage each one to use the individual talents that Hashem gave them in order to do the best they can with it in order to be successful, and that's going to make them happy, make us happy. Keep thinking with someone else. Doesn't matter what our age is. Whole life of thinking with someone else. It's a big struggle to be happy. The first thing is think about who we are. I see there's a question coming.
Trying to put a circle into a square.
Yeah, beautifully said. Beautifully said. And unfortunately, that was the point of what we just learned. That when you've got the guy who Hashem gave him the brain of a Gada, of understanding the depth in it, but you throw him into the mainstream, and you can destroy him. You could destroy that circle, and he could have become so incredible with what he had. We're going to go back to the story I had actually this week with someone who was really struggling with a relationship, and I actually believe it was coming from this. I believe that they kept trying to give the other person in the relationship something else because they kept thinking, I don't want to say how I can prove this because I don't give away any possible identity of an identity, but I could prove this, and I actually said it to them. I said, you keep acting like the person you're trying to, let's say it was a boss. You keep trying to give them what you think that they need because you've got an issue. I said, but the reality is they're with you because they want something different. And you keep giving them what you think that they used to have and what you think that they need, and it's not what they need. So if you actually work out who they are, but more importantly, who you are, you won't struggle with this anymore. You actually give them what they want. I said, I said, think about it. I said, why do you keep giving them what you know they don't want? They keep telling you it's not what they want. And I said, the reality is you keep giving it to them because you are not comfortable with who you are. You keep trying to be someone else. And there was a nod. There was a nod for the first time. There was a nod and an acceptance. I think that, on the way to, it's a lot of work afterwards to be able to get out of that emotional place. But for the first, it was an acceptance. I'm trying to be someone that I'm not, which is a big challenge for all of us. Okay, so that's the first part. So now we're going to connect this with Yaakov and Esau. So I've got a piece from Rav Hirsch here, which I've got translated to English. Of course, it's written in German, and I've also seen the Hebrew. But again, I've got the Hebrew and the English over here. I'm not sure. Again, it was obviously written in German originally. Maybe I'll even read it out of the English. Again, only the English girl's going to give out handouts, but it's now that people are on Zoom, I'm not going to do it. Let's work through a bit of this together, and we'll see how far we get. But again, I think the concept and what will come out will be more important than how much of this we actually go through inside. So he's dealing with a pasuk in Toldos. So he's dealing with two pasukim, really. One pasuk is in Toldos. It says V'yigdu l'hanaorim, the boys grew up, which again, of course, is what Mrs. Wilson wants us to speak about. By he Esau ish Yosef said ish Soda, and Esau was a man who understood hunting. Yaakov Ishtam, Yaakov was a single-minded man dwelling in tents, and then he's going to deal with the second pasuk, which is actually in last week's parasha, which deals with Ish Kevirchosei Berech Oisam, which speaks about the brachas that Yaakov gave at the end of his life. We're going to deal with that pasuk as well. So those are the two pasukim that we are now going to home in and focus on. Okay, so he's dealing with the words V'yigdalu when they grew up. So again, let me try reading from the English a little bit, and then we'll explain and we'll speak this out as we're going through. So he says something very shocking. He says something that we would never have the chutzpah to ever suggest or anything like that. But Rav Hirsch says it. He says our sages, right? Our sages, who never objected to draw attention to the small and great mistakes and weaknesses in the history of our great forefathers. I'll tell you what he's just said again. The English, the old-fashioned English. He said that, or he's basically saying that in the Torah, of course, we never speak bad about anybody, definitely not about, obviously a Mohos of, the great Tzaddikim and Tzikonius in the Torah itself, right? With one exception. That's when the Torah itself goes out and tells you that they made mistakes. Because when the Torah doesn't whitewash anything, it wants us to learn from those mistakes. No one was perfect. So again, however many people there were never made it in the Torah, but everyone else did. And the Torah actually tells us on occasions when they made mistakes, and it wants us to know in order that we can learn from those mistakes. So here is coming up a new one. Says Rav Hirsch. So he says, Chachamim never objected to let us know about all the great mistakes when they were there, because the Torah tells us about it. It's not like, some rabbi comes along and tells us. The Torah itself tells us. Okay. So he says, therefore, make just the more instructive for us, right? In order that we can learn from it. Okay. So it says Rav Hush, the word vayigdalu, the first word which is going to deal with Yaakov and Esau, the eternal struggle, where it's all going to start from and where it's all going to go wrong from. He says, made a remark which is a signpost for all of us. So this is where he goes. He says they point out. He says this is Rav Hush's, our rabbis point out the striking contrast in the grandchildren of Avraham. Because I asked you, what's the difference in the grandchildren? His grandchildren, of course, are Yaakov and Esau. Why did Yaakov go one way and Esau go in the opposite way? No, it really went in two very different, contrasting ways. So he asks, why did they go in the opposite paths, which led to the eternal struggle and everything that came from it? You think about that the stakes are pretty big here. The eternal struggle that we have to this day began Vayigdalu, began in this pasuk. What led to Vayigdalu? What led to the eternal struggle? What happened at the Vayigdalu stage? So says Rav Hush, he says the following. He says it was not so much a difference in their temperament as to the mistakes. This phrase is unbelievable, in the way that they were brought up. This is Rav Hush. He says it's from a Chachamim. We're allowed to speak this way because we're supposed to learn from it. He says it wasn't anything about their before they were born or after they were born, their nature, their teva, their friends. Perhaps it was all of that stuff. He says it was more down to how they were brought up. Very, very shocking way to speak. And he says we're allowed to speak this way. He says our sages, Chachamim told us this because they want us to learn from it. Okay, so he says as long as they were very little, vayigdalu, from the earliest point of their life, no attention was paid to the differences in their nature. Right? Now, were they different? Well, apparently, as my wife once said, apparently they were very, very different. Right? There's no question they were incredibly different.
Yeah.
Says Rav Hush based on Chazal that their parents, Yitzchak and Rivka, decided, or whatever the case was, did not pay attention or treated them the same. Right? They brought them up to be the same. Okay. It says no attention was paid to the slumbering differences in their natures. Both had exactly the same teaching and educational treatment. So you just picture it, whatever the punishments or the rewards were inside that home, whatever the Divrei Torah were, whatever the yeshiva they were sent to, whatever it was the same. Both had exactly the same teaching and educational treatment. He says, and the great phrase, we know, Chanach l'nara pidarkoi, which means, the famous phrase, bring up each child according to their own way, was forgotten in that home. Okay, again, I'm happy to share this with anybody who doesn't believe that he says this. It was forgotten in the home of Yitzchak and Rivka. Because he says, we're allowed to do this. Chachamim never rejected. They want us to do this in order that we can learn from this. He says, they're brought up exactly the same way. He says, you want to know why we have the eternal struggle today? He says, yes, there may have been other differences, but it was more with how they were brought up to be exactly the same. He says, and the concept really should have been that each one should be treated differently, with an eye to developing the special characteristics of the one and human Jewish life, right? And again, it's a long piece. We're not going to go through the whole thing. I'm going to jump a little bit to last week's parasha. It says when Jacob calls all the tribes in, right, to give them their brachas before he passes on, right? What does he see? He says he sees not only future priests and teachers. What else does he see? Think about the brachas. What does he see? He sees around him the tribe of Levi, royalty, merchants, farmers, soldiers. All the diversity. It was all there, right? And what does the pasuk say? Ish keberchasai berach oisam. Each one got blessed according to his speciality, right? What each tribe was supposed to be. What his individual path in life was going to be, he blessed them, right? That's what the Torah is telling us. That's what we see just now in Vayechi, which, again, I know I was asked to speak just after Vayechi about Apostigan told us, but it's very interesting that the same concept you see in Vayechi, just what we learned this week, together with told us, it's the same concept. Yaakov was telling the tribes, we just finished learning last week's parasha, that each tribe had a different purpose, and each person has a different purpose. And Yaakov got that. Didn't have an issue with it. He blessed each one. It wasn't like, looking down at the guy who wasn't going to be able to, academically cut it. He blessed each one according to what he had and how Hashem made him. And Bnei Israel needs every single part of it. Okay. So he says, strength and courage, no less than brain and lofty thoughts and fine feelings, are to have their representatives before Hashem, to achieve the one great common task of life, right? He says it's not better or worse. Again, we need each and every part. Okay. And he says it's the same thing in he says everyone's got different tendencies, but each one does it differently to lead to one great goal. Okay. So now we're going to speak about Yaakov and Esau. Because again, of course, tonight's session is about Yaakov and Esau. He says to try and bring up a Yaakov and Esau in the same way, make them have the same habits and hobbies. It looks like what was going on. Want to teach and educate them in the same way. Says Rav Hirsch, again, this is the translation to English, is the surest way to court disaster. And it's a very, very shocking phrase. But again, I think we can all relate to this. And I think the lesson we can, obviously very strongly take out of this is it doesn't matter who we have an impact on, even in our brains, who we're thinking about in terms of younger generations. This phrase, the surest way to court disaster, is the feeling that everyone has to be the same, everyone has to be educated the same, be given the same. He says that's the greatest, again, he says that's what we learned from Yaakov and Esau. They were given exactly the same at that point. Let me skip. Let me skip a little bit. Okay, this is the next paragraph. He says, had Yaakov and Rivka studied Esau's nature and character early enough and asked themselves how even an Esau, yes, he was born in certain tendencies, no question about it, how even an Esau, how can all the strength and energy, agility and courage that lies slumbering in that child? You hear what he had? His characteristics were strength and energy. Again, I think we can all think of, kids who have this strength and energy, agility and courage, right? He didn't have that spiritual side where he was going to cut it to be the Yaakov, but he had that strength, energy, agility, and courage. He said, had they thought about how they could have won it over to use in the service of Hashem, they says he wouldn't have become a Gibor Tzayid, as the Pasuk says, the hunter, but he would have become a Gibor Lifnei Hashem. He says, Yaakov and Esau, you wouldn't have had the eternal struggle, but instead, you would have had them in their totally different natures, remaining twin brothers in spirit and life. They would have worked hand in hand. And he says, what a different aspect the whole history of the ages would have presented. But it was Vayigdalu Hana Orim. It was only when the boys grew into men that all of a sudden two totally different people emerged with the eternal struggle that was going to follow because of how they were developed and how they were brought up. Again, he's not saying that was the only thing. It was more going to be down to how they were brought up to be exactly the same than their natures, which is crazy if you think about it. Again, we all know little boys, or now they can be big boys who are now 40, 50 years old, who have those characteristics of, again, what characteristics you use? Energy, agility, courage, and strength. We all know, when there's a boy who's 7 years old who, maybe he needs his ADHD medication, or whether it's the 40, 50-year-old has got those characteristics. And, the likelihood is, maybe it's because of the community, or because of the pressure, or because of the lack of thinking about it, but maybe they're being shoved into the mainstream and being told you have to be exactly like, the kid who's got the ability to sit and study, 8, 10, 12 hours a day, or whatever it is. But it's scary because Rav Hirsch is saying, do you know what he could have become? Yet you think, the way Rav Moshe Weinberger said it, he says, like, I don't know if he said it as a joke but it could have been very seriously. He said he could have become the greatest Kiruv rabbi of his generation in history because he had those characteristics. He had the courage to get out there and to deal with people. He had the strength. Nothing was going to hold him back. He had chutzpah. This is a guy who you could have put out there in the trenches to help people, to bring them close to Yiddishkeit. Who knows what the abilities that this guy had. We're not even talking about being a decent person and not sinning. On a Klal Yisrael level, there was not just a place for him, there was an unbelievable place for him. Because he had different characteristics. Unfortunately, because they weren't harnessed, he used them in the opposite direction. And that's where the eternal struggle began from. But the lesson that we see from here is really, really, really immense. Okay, so I'm not sure I'm going to share any more of this because I think the concept we've seen is enough. Again, I thought it'd be a little bit longer. I don't even know what time you go to normally. It's probably a little bit longer to go through this. But let me sum up what we've said because I think the concept is very, very strong. And as I'm speaking, if I'm the only one who gains from this, it was worthwhile anyway. But I think the concept is very, very strong. We started with what brings unhappiness. We're given a new element to think about. When either for ourselves we think about who we are. It doesn't matter what stage of life we're at, but we're always struggling to think about, I should be doing. It's not a question of becoming better or doing more in a certain area. We can always do more and always become better. But it's a question of, do I spend my focus of my life trying to, if I'm naturally someone who's, I don't know, into chesed, and I'm trying to, but then I'm trying to, put my limited energies into something totally different, which isn't my natural thing, perhaps that's not going to be a successful. Again, Hashem, but Dafka and especially gave everybody what he wants them to do with themselves. We don't need to fight. We need to work out what it is, which is going to lead us to the serenity and the happiness. It's going to lead to the serenity and the happiness with relationships with others, because we're going to know who we are and who they are, and try and give them what they need instead of trying to think with someone else. Can get rid of a lot of things like depression if we're not trying to be someone else, and a lot of frustration and anxiety. And we've really seen in terms of Yaakov and Esau, the eternal struggle, it likely would have developed in a totally different way. There would have been brothers hand in hand, we would have seen, if from the beginning they would have been allowed to have known who they both were and to harnessed who they were, rather than bring them up to be the same. And the lesson is just so immense. The pressure that we put on ourselves, and also people that we've got ability to impact, and the pressure that we put on them, because they've got to be someone else, because it bothers us, or what's going to be with them. You know what? Maybe what's going to be with them is going to be that they're going to work out their path, of course, with Torah mitzvahs, but in the way that Hashem made them. How they're going to do all the system? Okay, they're going to have to do the best they can with it, but in the long run, there's different places that these people can excel. And as we saw from last week's session with Yaakov, it's not the one is better. Yaakov understood that each part, he blessed each one according to what he needed. Each part is absolutely needed and is a major part of Klal Yisrael. So let's try and focus on who we are, trying to maximize what unique potential Hashem has given us, and in particular, people that we've got with people who we can have an impact on, to not get frustrated with them not necessarily being someone that they're not, and to try and harness them to try and be the best possible them. Okay, thank you. Absolutely.
I remember when came to, she said that Yaakov was more interested in the spirituality and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And Rivka was more interested in the practical. So surely Rivka could have worked out how Esau should have been brought.
Okay, you're asking a very good question. Another one of my Talmudim asked the question in a different way this week, maybe less sophisticated. You're asking in a really sophisticated way, but he asked also an incredibly important question, which was, how could such people have made mistakes? So whether you're going to ask like that, or you're going to ask that was Hateva to be in a certain way, how could it have been? The reality is Chazal don't whitewash it, the Torah doesn't whitewash it. However great people were, the Torah tells us that that they all made mistakes. It tells us. So you're going to ask the how or the why or the what. Okay, so people made mistakes. Maybe Siyata Shema was taken away from them in a certain area. Maybe they made a mistake. Maybe something got in the way. A midah got in the way. We can't know on an individual basis necessarily how such a thing happened, especially when it seems to be against their nature. It's a very, very good question. And how can somebody so great? And again, I guess it's on their level. It's on their level they made a mistake. But however you want to, dumb it down and say, oh, it wasn't quite like this, it wasn't quite like that. But however you want to say it, Chazal and the Torah are telling us that a mistake was made. maybe it was on their level, and we can't relate to it 100%. For us, we wouldn't, if we, we wouldn't even be able to understand it's a mistake and whatever. They would have a million answers for it, on our level. But on some level, somehow, even with what they were given, no, people are human, and that's what Torah is trying to teach us. And it's a question of learning from it and just trying to become better. But it is a good question as to the how. We may never exactly know that.